Chapter 1. The Origins and the Essence of the Enneagram. We are all driven by a profound and unyielding inner restlessness. It echoes within us as a quiet suspicion that something vital is missing, though we often struggle to define exactly what that missing piece might be. We chase after external solutions, a better relationship, a more prestigious job, a flawless physique, or new possessions. We convince ourselves that once we acquire these things, the restlessness will finally subside, leaving us satisfied and complete. Yet, experience repeatedly teaches us otherwise. The thrill of a new acquisition fades, and even the most wonderful relationships cannot entirely address the deep hunger of the soul. If we pause and reflect, we realize that what our hearts truly yearn for is to understand who we are and why we are here. Our culture does little to encourage this inward gaze, conditioning us instead to believe that our lives will improve only if our external circumstances improve. Many paths of personal transformation speak beautifully about the virtues we wish to embody: compassion, creativity, and community. Yet, as much as our hearts yearn to soar, we frequently come crashing down against the rocks of our own fears, self-defeating habits, and ignorance. Our most noble hopes often transform into fresh sources of disappointment, leading us to abandon our efforts and return to familiar distractions. We must ask whether human beings are genuinely incapable of living fulfilling lives, or if the popular prescriptions for growth are simply incomplete. The truth is that most approaches to transformation fail because they do not account for the fundamental differences in human personality. What serves as a breakthrough for one individual can be disastrous for another. Telling a person who is drowning in emotion to focus more on their feelings is as misguided as putting someone starving on a diet. Our personality type is the lens through which we view reality. It dictates how we express ourselves, defend ourselves, and navigate our relationships. Understanding this filter is the necessary first step on any authentic spiritual journey. Consider a moment of profound clarity that occurred during a grueling spiritual retreat. Amidst intense heat, physical exhaustion, and the deliberate provocation of personality conflicts by a wise teacher, an extraordinary shift in perception took place. One participant, exhausted and longing for rest, found his sleep shattered by a frustrated, noisy roommate. Normally, this would trigger an explosive reaction of anger and self-justification, but in a rare moment of simple observation, the participant watched his own anger rising like a train pulling into a station, and he chose not to board that train. By observing the reaction without acting upon it, a veil was lifted. The world suddenly became intensely alive, and everyone in the room was revealed as a being of light. It became clear that each of us is made of radiant light, but over time, a thick, dark crust of conditioning and defense mechanisms has obscured our true nature. For some, the crust is thick from years of trauma. For others, it is thinner, allowing more of the inner light to shine through. This vision is not a metaphor, it is the reality of the human condition. By truthfully and non-judgmentally observing the mechanisms of our personality in action, we can wake up, shedding the crust to reveal the miraculous beauty within. The Enneagram is the map that guides us through this process of awakening. It is a geometric figure that charts the 9 fundamental personality types of human nature and their complex interrelationships. Rooted in the perennial philosophy of ancient spiritual traditions and refined by modern psychology, the Enneagram reveals that human beings are spiritual presences mysteriously incarnated in the material world. Beneath our surface differences, behind the veils of illusion, the light of divinity shines within each individual. The Enneagram steps aside from doctrinal differences, offering a universal framework for self-knowledge. Without such self-knowledge, any spiritual progress we make will be fragile and fleeting. The ego loves to flatter itself, leaping toward transcendent heights before addressing the unfree, darker aspects of the psyche. The Enneagram prevents this self-deception by meeting us exactly where we are, illuminating our mechanical reactions with startling clarity. There are 9 distinct ways of being in the world, 9 different perspectives on life, each with its own extraordinary gifts and predictable pitfalls. The reformer leads through integrity and reason but can be hindered by perfectionism and a simmering repressed resentment. The helper shines with generosity and healing power but struggles with people-pleasing and an unrecognized possessiveness. The achiever becomes an inspiring example of excellence but can blindly pursue success, image, and status. The individualist models creativity and intuitive depth, but is often held back by moodiness, self-consciousness, and a feeling of being fundamentally flawed. The investigator demonstrates visionary intellect and inventiveness, but risks becoming increasingly eccentric and isolated in the realm of the mind. The loyalist exemplifies courage and commitment, but fights a constant, exhausting battle against anxiety and rebelliousness. The enthusiast brings high spirits and accomplishment, but can be waylaid by impulsiveness and a frantic avoidance of pain. The challenger acts as a powerful, magnanimous leader, but can easily slip into controlling and intimidating others. Finally, the peacemaker brings people together to heal conflicts, but is frequently held back by passivity, complacency, and a stubborn refusal to engage. To discover where you stand within this profound system, you must embark on an inward quest, observing the general attitudes and philosophies that have shaped your life. This is not a matter of taking a simple test, but of deep, intuitive self-reflection. You might recognize yourself as someone who meets life head-on, asserting your independence and driving hard toward your goals. Alternatively, you might realize that you have always been quieter, comfortable in your own imagination, avoiding the competitive spotlight. Or perhaps you recognize a lifelong pattern of extreme responsibility, repeatedly sacrificing your own needs to fulfill your duties to others. Alongside these fundamental orientations, you must examine how you process your reality and your emotions. Do you instinctively maintain a positive outlook, distracting yourself from dark realities by finding something to be enthusiastic about, even if it means neglecting your own problems? Or are you a person of intense, unguarded feelings, demanding authenticity and needing others to mirror your emotional depth and intensity? Perhaps you relate more to a stance of emotional detachment, favoring logic and self-control, viewing your own visceral reactions as a dangerous distraction from efficiency. By honestly combining these internal coordinates, your degree of assertiveness and your method of emotional regulation, your specific personality type begins to emerge from the shadows. It is crucial to remember that while we possess a mixture of all 9 types, one pattern serves as our home base. This basic type remains constant throughout our lives, though we constantly fluctuate between its healthy, average, and unhealthy expressions. Identifying your type is rarely a comfortable experience. It is often accompanied by waves of relief, embarrassment, and sudden, undeniable clarity about the patterns that have governed your life. Yet, knowing your type is not the final destination. The Enneagram is not meant to box you into a rigid identity or provide a convenient excuse for poor behavior. It is a tool designed to expose the trance of your personality. The goal is to stop the automatic reactions by bringing awareness to them, gradually identifying less with the mechanical ego and stepping fully into spiritual freedom. The lineage of this profound psychological map is a hybrid of ancient wisdom and modern inquiry. While the Enneagram symbol itself is ancient, dating back over 2.5 millennia with roots in classical Greek thought, Pythagoras, and Neoplatonic philosophy, its application to personality types is a recent synthesis. The symbol was brought to the modern world by George Ivanovich Gurdjieff, a relentless seeker of lost esoteric sciences. Gurdjieff taught that the Enneagram represents the fundamental laws of the universe. The circle symbolizes the ultimate unity and wholeness of all things. Within it, the triangle represents the law of 3, the understanding that everything in existence is the result of the interaction of 3 forces, echoing the Trinitarian concepts found in the world's great religions. The complex hexad figure traces the law of 7, symbolizing how everything evolves and transforms over time. For Gurdjieff, the Enneagram was a dynamic living model of natural processes, a key to understanding our objective purpose. It was Oscar Ichazo who later connected this ancient geometric symbol with the 9 personality types. Drawing from early Christian desert fathers, the Kabbalah's tree of life, and the classical concept of the divine attributes, Ichazo recognized how the distortion of these divine qualities produced the 9 core passions. These passions are not merely moral failings, they are the specific ways in which we miss the mark, lose our center, and become trapped in the ego. Anger is repressed into chronic resentment. Pride denies its own suffering to extract value from helping others. Deceit chases hollow vanity. Envy longs for what is missing. Avarice hoards inner resources against depletion. Fear anticipates endless catastrophes. Gluttony devours experiences to fill an inner void. Lust aggressively pushes for intensity and control. And sloth willfully checks out of life's vitality. Building upon this, Claudio Naranjo and others integrated modern psychiatric insights, expanding the system into the robust psychological framework we use today. The ultimate purpose of this map is best understood through a traditional Sufi teaching story. Once, a skilled locksmith was unjustly imprisoned in a dark, inescapable dungeon. His loving wife pleaded with the king to bring him a simple prayer rug so he could perform his daily prostrations. The king, finding the request harmless, agreed. For years the locksmith prayed faithfully on the rug, begging the heavens for deliverance. One day, a sudden, blinding realization struck him. Woven into the intricate pattern of the prayer rug was the exact design of the lock that held him captive. The means of his escape had been right beneath his nose the entire time. Realizing this, he befriended his guards, bartered for scraps of metal, and forged the key that set him and his captors free. We are all the locksmith, and we are all living in a prison of our own making. Our personality is the lock, and the Enneagram is the prayer rug bearing the exact pattern of our confinement. We have spent our lives praying for freedom, unaware that the map to our escape is already in our possession. All we must do is awaken, read the pattern of our own soul, and forge the key. Chapter 2. Essence and Personality and Cultivating Awareness. The fundamental truth of the Enneagram is that you are infinitely more than your personality. What we take to be our character, our quirks, and our identity is merely the conditioned surface of a much vaster, largely unrecognized quality of being. This deeper ground of our existence is our essence. In many spiritual traditions, it is recognized as the spark of the divine within us. Over time, however, we fall asleep to this profound truth. We lose the direct experience of our own divine nature and, consequently, stop seeing the miraculous light in others. Instead, we become hardened, cynical, and defensive, treating the world as something to be managed or exploited. We often mistake the soul for the personality, but if our essence were a deep river, the soul would be the water itself, and the personality merely the frozen, rigid chunks of ice floating on the surface. Our transformational work begins when we use the Enneagram not to put ourselves into a psychological box, but to illuminate the box we are already trapped in, allowing our true essence to thaw and flow freely once again. This journey requires a sacred psychology, a bridge between the spiritual and the psychological realms. Psychology, without spirituality, can lead to a dry, clinical understanding of our wounds, while spirituality without psychology often results in grandiosity and a dangerous detachment from reality. The Enneagram unites them, revealing exactly how we abandon our true nature. In childhood, we instinctively developed a repertoire of coping strategies to survive our environment and to compensate for where we were most hurt. These strategies became our personality. As these defenses hardened, they cut us off from our essence, generating a deep, unconscious anxiety that takes the form of the 9 passions. We essentially went to sleep, sleepwalking through our days, magnetized by the narrow preoccupations of the ego. Yet our personality is not evil or inherently flawed. It is a necessary phase of early development that simply became arrested. We settled for living in a dark, cramped basement closet of a magnificent mansion, forgetting that we actually own the entire estate. When we realize that we are not our personality, a miracle occurs. We cease defending the false self, and our essential nature spontaneously begins to arise. Fearing the loss of our identity, we often resist this awakening, believing that letting go of our personality means becoming a blank slate or losing our effectiveness in the world. The exact opposite is true. When we contact our essence, the personality does not vanish. It becomes transparent and flexible. It transforms from a rigid, compulsive master into a highly useful vehicle. When we are deeply present, we experience moments of peak flow and effortless grace, whereas the mechanical habits of the personality typically cause us to make mistakes, overlook crucial details, and create unnecessary conflicts. Awakening does not destroy our identity. It expands it to include a continuous, active intelligence. This mechanical personality is driven by a profound internal engine, the dynamic between our basic fear and our basic desire. In our earliest years, despite the best intentions of our parents, our developmental needs could not be perfectly met. Because our caregivers could only mirror the emotional capacities that were unblocked within themselves, our own innate, spontaneous expressions were often met with anxiety, frustration, or indifference. This lack of mirroring created a deep sense of deficiency, leading us to subconsciously conclude that something was fundamentally wrong with us. We developed a basic fear. We began to fear being inherently defective or corrupt, being unworthy of love, being entirely worthless without success, being utterly without identity, being totally useless or incompetent, being completely without support or guidance, being trapped in endless deprivation and pain, being hopelessly harmed or controlled by others, or being completely fragmented and disconnected from life. To survive this terrifying underlying anxiety, the ego constructs a basic desire, a relentless pursuit of whatever it believes will save it and make it whole. We chase after absolute integrity, unconditional love, worldly value, authentic identity, absolute competence, unwavering security, endless happiness, impenetrable self-protection, or undisturbed peace. While these are legitimate, beautiful human needs, the personality pursues them with such desperate distortion that they become entirely self-defeating. The pursuit of integrity warps into critical perfectionism. The desire to be loved twists into a manipulative need to be needed. The longing for value degrades into a hollow chase for status. We chase uniqueness and fall into self-indulgence, seek competence but isolate ourselves in useless specialization, long for security but attach blindly to external dogmas. We run after happiness but fall into frenetic escapism, seek protection but engage in endless combat, and desire peace only to sink into a stubborn neglect of our own vitality. We become trapped in a continuous flight from our basic fear, single-mindedly pursuing our basic desire, all while starving our true nature. Our personality acted as a protective cast over a broken limb. It shielded us where we were most deeply wounded, allowing us to survive. But a cast left on permanently ultimately withers and atrophies the limb it was meant to protect. We must endure the pain of removing it, facing the childhood messages that shut us down, and mourning the lost messages we so desperately needed to hear. The reassurance that we are good, that we are wanted, that we are loved for ourselves, that we are truly seen for who we are, that our needs are not a problem, that we are safe, that we will be taken care of, that we will not be betrayed, and that our presence truly matters. No matter how deeply these early deficits cut, we must remember one unshakable truth. Our essence cannot be harmed. It remains pure and intact beneath the darkest, thickest layers of our conditioning, waiting for the moment we are brave enough to let it emerge. How, then, do we access this indestructible essence in the midst of our daily lives? The answer lies in the art of cultivating awareness. We must learn to become the impartial witness to our own mechanical behavior. By catching ourselves in the act of playing out the dictates of our personality, we interrupt the trance. When we observe our own anger, self-justification, or avoidance arising in the present moment, and when we watch it without judgment and without acting upon it, the old patterns begin to lose their grip. This kind of awareness is a matter of life and death for the soul. An unchecked personality can literally destroy us, driving us blindly off a cliff out of sheer bravado, anxiety, or stubbornness, much like a reckless driver ignoring the frantic warnings of a collapsed bridge ahead. Waking up requires recognizing that we have been asleep, lost in the inner chatter of our minds. Awareness is not thinking, it is not feeling, it is not merely moving through the world. It is the profound capacity to step back and observe the mind thinking, the heart feeling, and the body moving. It is the act of conscious looking. When we expand our awareness, we loosen the magnetic pull of our anxieties and daydreams, bringing fresh solutions and an enriched connection to the world around us. The most vital skill on this inward journey is learning to observe and let go. We are heavily conditioned to believe we must relentlessly fix ourselves, violently excising the parts we despise. But self-improvement projects initiated by the ego only lead to inner warfare, with one part of the mind acting as judge, jury, and executioner over another. Real change occurs when we simply observe our habits. We must witness when we are value-judging ourselves, giving our inherent value away to others, putting on a false image, making negative comparisons, isolating ourselves in abstract interpretations, clinging to external support, frantically anticipating the future, forcing control upon our lives, or stubbornly resisting our own experiences. When we bring a quiet, centered presence to these habits without trying to eradicate them, they spontaneously dissolve. We drop the heavy emotional baggage we have carried for decades, not by forceful willpower, but by the miracle of conscious presence. To sustain this, we must actively develop the inner observer. Our ordinary state is one of constant identification, which is essentially an escape from the self. We identify with an itch, a memory, a passing irritation, or a grandiose thought, shrinking our awareness down to the size of that single distraction. Over a lifetime, we have become fiercely identified with a very narrow band of our human potential, locking ourselves into an ego image. We identify exclusively with our superego's discerning judgments, our emotional reactions toward others, our curated achievements and desirability, our sense of feeling uniquely flawed, our detached role as the outside observer, our frantic responses to inner anxiety, our energetic anticipation of tomorrow, our aggressive resistance to the environment, or our numbed disengagement from intense impulses. Tracking the continuum of our awareness reveals how consistently and desperately we flee the present moment to maintain these limiting illusions. Inevitably, as we practice staying open, profound anxiety arises. Pushing the envelope of our personality forces us to face the very pain we have successfully defended against all our lives. The ego fears that if it drops its defenses, the deepest childhood wounds will be exposed and we will be abandoned, humiliated, or destroyed. We falsely fear that being present means losing our edge, our competence, or our drive, becoming spacey or ineffective. Yet, as we gather the courage to face the pain we have run from, we discover a subtle, exquisite presence filling us. This presence is not an abstract concept. It is the visceral, grounded sensation of being completely alive, taking in reality without distortion, and participating fully in the richness of the moment without self-consciousness or artifice. This presence offers us a supreme invitation to true abundance. It calls us to live for a higher purpose, to nurture ourselves and the world, to develop our capacities as an inspiring example, to let go of the painful past and be renewed, to observe reality with pristine clarity, to trust deeply in the goodness of life, to joyously celebrate our existence, to stand strong for what is right, and to bring inexhaustible peace into our world. By cultivating awareness and refusing to fall back into the sleep of the personality, we finally forge the key that unlocks the prison of the ego, stepping out into the radiant light of our own essential nature. Chapter 3: The Triadic Self and Enneagram Dynamics. To truly grasp the architecture of human personality, we must look beyond the 9 individual types and understand the underlying framework that organizes them. The Enneagram is not a static list of isolated traits. It is a living, dynamic map of human intelligence and energy. Central to this map is the profound concept of the triadic self. According to ancient wisdom traditions and modern psychological observation alike, human beings operate through 3 distinct centers of intelligence: the body, the heart, and the head. These are not merely metaphorical concepts, but profound energetic hubs that dictate how we process reality, defend our egos, and ultimately, how we reconnect with our essential nature. While we all possess instinct, feeling, and thought, our basic personality type is rooted heavily in the distortion and over-reliance of just one of these centers. The instinctual center, encompassing the challenger, the peacemaker, and the reformer, is grounded in the body and the gut. This triad is fundamentally concerned with maintaining resistance against the environment, establishing personal boundaries, and asserting a sense of autonomy in a world that feels intrusive. The core, often unconscious, emotional struggle driving this triad is anger or rage. Each of these 3 types handles this primal energy differently. The challenger expresses this anger outwardly, pushing against the world to secure dominance and ensure they are never controlled. The peacemaker, conversely, goes to sleep to their anger, forcefully denying its existence to maintain an illusion of internal tranquility and external harmony. The reformer internalizes this anger, transforming it into a rigid, burning resentment directed at themselves and others for failing to meet an impossible ideal of perfection. For all three, the journey to awakening requires acknowledging and integrating this raw, vital energy rather than fighting it. The feeling center includes the helper, the achiever, and the individualist. This triad operates through the heart and is profoundly preoccupied with self-image, identity, and the desperate search for authentic value. The underlying emotional wound here is deep-seated shame. To compensate for a quiet terror that they are inherently worthless or unseen, these types create a false persona, a curated image to present to the world. The helper attempts to overcome shame by becoming indispensable, hoping to be loved for their supreme goodness and endless sacrifice. The achiever relentlessly pursues success, status, and external validation, burying their true feelings beneath a polished veneer of flawless accomplishment. The individualist leans heavily into their shame, crafting an identity around being uniquely flawed or tragically misunderstood, hoping that this artistic specialness will finally bring them the rescue and profound connection they crave. Healing for the heart triad demands dropping the mask and trusting that their true, naked self is already inherently valuable. The thinking center comprises the investigator, the loyalist, and the enthusiast. Grounded in the mind, this triad is hyper-focused on security, strategy, and navigating a world perceived as fundamentally unpredictable, overwhelming, or unsafe. The driving undercurrent here is fear and chronic anxiety. The investigator retreats inward, attempting to master fear through intense observation, knowledge accumulation, and extreme detachment from the exhausting demands of others. The loyalist frantically scans the horizon for potential threats, oscillating endlessly between clinging to authority figures for protection and rebelling against them when trust is inevitably broken. The enthusiast attempts to outrun fear entirely, filling their mind with exciting plans, manic adventures, and endless possibilities to avoid ever feeling the dark, paralyzing grip of their own anxiety. For the mind triad, liberation comes from quieting the frantic mental chatter and discovering an unshakable inner guidance. Yet, the Enneagram circle tells us that no individual is a pure, isolated type. We are profoundly influenced by our immediate neighbors on the circumference, known as our wings. These adjacent energies color our core type, adding necessary nuance, contradiction, and complexity to our behavior. A reformer might lean heavily toward the idealistic, detached nature of the peacemaker, or they might draw upon the interpersonal warmth and emotional engagement of the helper. These wings represent the psychological territory we must integrate to broaden our perspective and loosen the rigidity of our ego. They are not secondary personality types, but rather the complementary elements that give our fundamental nature its unique flavor and texture. Furthermore, the Enneagram is a map of internal motion. The geometric lines intersecting the inner circle reveal the predictable, universal paths of our psychological deterioration and our spiritual elevation. When we are caught in the grip of severe stress, our primary defenses inevitably begin to fail. In these moments of crisis, we unconsciously travel down the direction of disintegration, temporarily taking on the destructive traits of another specific type to survive. The driven achiever suddenly collapses into the apathetic numbness of the peacemaker. The withdrawn investigator suddenly acts out with the scattered, frantic energy of the enthusiast. This is an automatic survival mechanism, a desperate pressure valve releasing mounting internal tension. By recognizing our stress point, we can catch ourselves before we plunge into complete unconsciousness. Conversely, as we cultivate awareness and loosen the terrifying grip of our ego, we naturally move toward our direction of integration. This path reveals the specific, challenging qualities we need to embody for our profound healing and maturation. The fearful loyalist steps into the calm, grounded courage of the peacemaker. The resentful reformer discovers the spontaneous, forgiving joy of the enthusiast. This movement is not about changing who we fundamentally are, but about reclaiming the fragmented, neglected pieces of our essence. The Enneagram thus reveals itself not as a psychological prison, but as a dynamic, living pathway to liberation. By understanding the triad that governs our deepest wounds and the internal lines that map our stress and growth, we prepare ourselves to look unblinkingly into the specific, intricate mechanics of our own personality. Chapter 4. The Reformer and the Helper. As we begin our detailed descent into the 9 distinct landscapes of the human psyche, we start where the Enneagram's inner triangle anchors itself to the world of instinct and action. The journey begins with the rigid, deeply principled energy of Type 1, known as the reformer. Ones are individuals who have built their entire sense of self upon a foundation of profound moral obligation. They possess a sweeping, visionary sense of how the world ought to be, paired with an excruciatingly sharp awareness of how far short the world and they themselves fall from that ideal. To be a one is to live under the relentless, unyielding gaze of a strict internal judge. This inner critic is a powerful superego that constantly evaluates, corrects, and condemns, whispering and often shouting that nothing is ever quite good enough. For the reformer, the universe is a messy, flawed place, and they have unconsciously taken on the impossible burden of fixing it. The core anxiety driving the reformer is a terrifying, foundational fear of being inherently corrupt, evil, or defective. To defend against this unbearable dread, the ego constructs a singular, desperate desire to have absolute integrity, to be perfectly good, and to always be right. In their earliest years, ones often experienced a profound sense of disconnection from their protective caregiver. They absorbed the message that they had to justify their own existence by being responsible, mature, and above reproach. They became the adults in the room far too soon, swallowing their childish impulses and natural spontaneity because those messy qualities were perceived as unacceptable. To survive, they forged an ironclad alliance with their inner critic, mistakenly believing that if they judged themselves harshly enough, they could preempt the judgment of the outside world and finally secure a sense of safety and unconditional love. Because the reformer is grounded in the instinctual center, their primary emotional struggle revolves around the raw energy of anger. Yet, because their superego dictates that getting angry is a flaw, a loss of control that signifies being bad, this vital life force is strictly repressed. It does not disappear. Rather, it ferments and transforms into a chronic, simmering resentment. Ones walk through life carrying a heavy physical and emotional tension, deeply resentful that they are sacrificing so much to do the right thing while the rest of humanity seemingly gets away with murder. This resentment leaks out in tight jaws, clipped tones, rigid posture, and a compulsive need to correct others' grammar, behavior, or methods. They become trapped in a self-defeating cycle, striving for an unreachable perfection, failing inevitably because perfection is an illusion, and then punishing themselves with agonizing guilt. True transformation for the reformer does not come from trying harder or becoming even more disciplined. Healing begins when they recognize the voice of the inner critic not as the voice of absolute truth or the voice of God, but simply as a mechanical, conditioned tape recording from childhood. By observing this relentless judgment without acting upon it, the one begins to create space. They learn to separate their true essence from the rigid rules of their personality. As this tight grip relaxes, they naturally move toward the spontaneous, joyful energy of their integration point, the enthusiast. They begin to access a profound objective wisdom, realizing that true perfection is not a state of flawlessness to be achieved through grueling effort, but the inherent, underlying reality of everything that exists. They discover the miraculous grace of allowing things, including themselves, to simply be messy, human, and inherently worthy. Moving clockwise around the Enneagram circumference, we transition from the gut-driven morality of the reformer into the expansive heart-driven territory of the feeling center. Here we encounter Type 2, known as the helper. If the one attempts to justify their existence by being perfectly correct, the two attempts to secure their place in the universe by becoming perfectly indispensable. Twos exude a profound, radiant warmth. They are empathetic, generous, and acutely attuned to the suffering and needs of everyone around them. They are the friends who drop everything in a crisis, the partners who anticipate desires before they are spoken, and the caregivers who pour their lifeblood into nurturing others. Yet beneath this beautiful, self-sacrificing exterior lies a deep, unacknowledged psychological strategy designed to ward off a terrifying internal darkness. The basic fear haunting the helper is the quiet, devastating suspicion that they are inherently unworthy of being loved for who they are. To combat this profound shame, the two's ego constructs a relentless basic desire to feel loved, wanted, and appreciated. In childhood, twos often learned that their own needs were an inconvenience or a burden to their caregivers. They subconsciously concluded that the only way to earn love and a secure place in the family was to suppress their own desires and become fiercely attentive to what others required. They learned to read the emotional weather of a room perfectly, adapting themselves into whatever shape was needed to bring comfort, thereby making themselves too valuable to be abandoned. Giving, for the two, is rarely completely free. It is the currency they use to purchase emotional security. Because they reside squarely in the feeling center, the two struggles profoundly with a false sense of identity. Their ego is fortified by the passion of pride. This is not the boastful pride of arrogance, but a subtle, self-deceptive pride that insists, "I do not have any needs. I am the strong one who gives. Others are the weak ones who need me." This pride prevents the helper from acknowledging their own exhaustion, loneliness, and deep yearning for care. They project an image of absolute self-sufficiency while secretly harboring the expectation that if they love others well enough, others will naturally reciprocate without ever having to be asked. When this unspoken contract is inevitably broken, when their sacrifices go unnoticed or unrewarded, the two's suppressed needs erupt as feelings of victimization, emotional manipulation, and a surprising intrusive possessiveness over the people they have helped. The path of awakening for the helper requires immense courage, for it demands turning their powerful, empathetic gaze inward. They must face the terrifying vulnerability of admitting that they have their own needs, and they must risk asking for what they want directly, without wrapping it in an act of service. When a two begins to observe their compulsive drive to flatter, rescue, and enmesh themselves in others' lives, they interrupt the trance of their pride. As they let go of the belief that they must constantly earn their keep, they naturally move toward their integration point, the emotionally honest, deeply authentic energy of the individualist. They learn to nurture themselves with the same fierce devotion they once reserved exclusively for the world. In doing so, their giving undergoes an alchemical shift. It ceases to be a frantic, manipulative strategy for survival and transforms into pure, unconditional love, a radiant overflow of their own full, self-nurtured heart. Chapter 5. The Achiever and the Individualist. Continuing our exploration of the feeling center, we arrive at the very heart of the Enneagram's middle triad, where the psychological struggle with identity and profound, hidden shame reaches its absolute peak. Here we encounter Type 3, known as the Achiever. While the helper attempts to secure love through boundless service, the Achiever seeks to conquer the universe through flawless performance and undeniable success. Threes are the stars of human society. They are adaptable, driven, efficient, and extraordinarily capable of transforming themselves into the exact embodiment of whatever their culture defines as valuable. Whether they are climbing the corporate ladder, starring on a stage, or becoming the perfect, glowing center of their community, threes possess an uncanny ability to read the room and instantly deliver the winning image. Yet behind the dazzling smile and the impressive resume lies a devastating psychological trap. The primary anxiety that haunts the Achiever is the quiet, terrifying belief that they are inherently worthless unless they are actively producing, succeeding, and winning the admiration of others. To silence this profound dread, their ego constructs a relentless basic desire to feel valuable, worthwhile, and admired. In their early childhood, threes usually absorb the message that they were not loved for who they intrinsically were, but for what they could do. They were rewarded for their achievements, their good grades, their athletic prowess, or simply for looking perfect and making the family proud. Slowly and unconsciously, they disconnected from their own authentic feelings and desires. They traded their true, spontaneous soul for a shiny, highly marketable persona. They learned to bury their own heart because emotions are messy, inefficient, and often get in the way of crossing the finish line. Because they sit squarely in the center of the feeling triad, it is fiercely ironic that threes are the most disconnected from their own authentic emotions. Their passion is deceit. This is rarely a malicious, calculated deception of others. Rather, it is a profound, tragic deception of themselves. The three begins to believe that they actually are the mask they wear. They mistake external validation for internal substance. They run a never-ending marathon, terrifyingly aware that if they ever stop producing, the applause will cease and they will be left facing the agonizing emptiness of their own inner void. They become human doings rather than human beings, frantically adjusting their image, terrified of failure because to the achiever, failing at a task means failing as a human being. The awakening for the achiever requires a terrifying leap into vulnerability. Transformation begins when the 3 dares to stop performing. They must summon the immense courage to sit still, risking the terrifying feeling of being unproductive, and wait for their own authentic, long-buried feelings to rise to the surface. When they can observe their compulsive need to manage their image and impress others, the trance of deceit is broken. As they let go of the relentless drive for external validation, they naturally move toward the profound, committed loyalty of their integration point, the loyalist. They shift from asking, "How can I shine?" to asking, "How can I serve the team?" The desperate need to be the solitary star dissolves into a beautiful, grounded cooperativeness. They discover the miraculous truth that they are deeply loved and infinitely valuable simply for existing without having to accomplish a single thing. As we move further around the Enneagram circle, we encounter the final member of the feeling center, type 4, known as the individualist. If the 3 attempts to outrun their underlying shame by building a flawless, universally admired image, the 4 takes the exact opposite approach. The 4 leans entirely into the shame, absorbing it and building an entire identity around the feeling of being fundamentally flawed, tragic, and utterly different from everyone else. 4s are the romantics, the artists, and the deep sea divers of the human psyche. They possess an exquisite sensitivity, a profound connection to beauty, and a willingness to explore the dark, melancholic depths of human emotion that terrify other types. Yet, this beautiful depth is often hijacked by a painful, isolating ego structure. The core fear of the individualist is the terrifying prospect of having no identity or personal significance, of being painfully ordinary and utterly invisible. To combat this, they develop a fierce basic desire to find themselves and their unique significance, to create an identity out of their internal emotional landscape. In childhood, 4s frequently experienced a profound sense of disconnection from both parents. They felt like aliens dropped into the wrong family, concluding that something essential was missing in them. They believed that if they were whole, they would not have been abandoned or misunderstood. To cope, they turned inward, constructing a fantasy self, an idealized image of who they could be if only they were rescued. They romanticize the past, long for a perfect future, and find the present moment unbearably mundane. The driving passion of the individualist is envy. This is not necessarily a crude jealousy of others' possessions, but a deep, sorrowful ache that others possess some fundamental quality of normalcy, happiness, or belonging that the 4 was inexplicably denied. They constantly compare their turbulent internal reality with the seemingly cheerful, untroubled exteriors of those around them, reinforcing their own sense of tragic isolation. They become addicted to their own melancholy, confusing the intensity of their emotional suffering with the depth of their true essence. The 4 unconsciously believes that if they suffer beautifully enough, a rescuer will finally recognize their unique value and save them from their profound loneliness. They push people away with their intense moods and demands for absolute authenticity, while simultaneously desperate for someone to break through their walls and refuse to leave. To awaken, the individualist must recognize that their feelings, no matter how profound or intense, are not facts, and they are not their true identity. Healing requires observing the mechanical habit of sinking into moody self-absorption and the constant, painful comparisons to others. The 4 must realize that the missing piece they have been searching for their entire lives has never been missing. It has merely been obscured by their own self-dramatization. When they interrupt this painful trance, they naturally move toward the objective, grounded, and principled energy of their integration point, the reformer. They step out of the swirling tempest of their imagination and into the disciplined action of the present moment. They bring their immense creativity and emotional depth into the real world, no longer waiting to be rescued, but participating in life with profound, equanimous grace. Chapter 6. The Investigator and the Loyalist. Leaving the emotionally turbulent territory of the feeling center, we cross the threshold into the realm of the mind. Here, within the thinking center, the foundational emotional undercurrent shifts dramatically from shame to fear. The types residing in this mental landscape are intensely preoccupied with security, strategy, and navigating an environment they perceive as inherently unpredictable and fundamentally unsafe. We begin this exploration with Type 5, known as the investigator. If the types of the heart triad seek to establish their place in the world by managing their image, the investigator seeks to survive the world by retreating from it entirely, observing reality from the safe, fortified tower of the intellect. Fives are the visionaries, the intense scholars, and the eccentric pioneers of the Enneagram. They possess an extraordinary capacity for concentration, an unquenchable thirst for objective knowledge, and a remarkable ability to perceive complex patterns that remain completely invisible to others. Yet, this brilliant mental capacity is often utilized as a sophisticated defense mechanism against the overwhelming demands of physical and emotional existence. The core anxiety driving the investigator is a profound dread of being useless, helpless, or entirely incapable of functioning successfully in the world. To counter this terrifying vulnerability, their ego constructs a powerful basic desire to be utterly competent and to master a specific body of knowledge or skill. In early childhood, fives frequently experienced their environment as deeply intrusive. Whether they were engulfed by overbearing caregivers or left feeling dangerously unprotected, they concluded that the external world was demanding far more energy than they possessed. To survive, they made a radical psychological decision. They cut off their connection to the physical body and the messy realm of emotions, retreating upward into the pristine, controllable sanctuary of the mind. They became solitary observers, convincing themselves that if they could just gather enough information and understand how everything works from a distance, they would eventually be safe enough to participate in life. The tragic irony of the investigator is that the time to participate never arrives. Their driving passion is avarice, which is rarely about hoarding material wealth. Instead, it is a desperate hoarding of their own internal resources, their time, their space, and their physical energy. Because fives feel they possess only a finite, rapidly depleting battery of life force, they fiercely guard their boundaries. They minimize their own needs, living as ascetics within their own lives, believing that by wanting less, they will be less dependent on a world that drains them. They approach relationships with extreme caution, terrifyingly aware that human connection requires emotional expenditure. Consequently, they isolate themselves in increasingly narrow, specialized rabbit holes of thought. They mistake thinking about reality for actually experiencing reality, accumulating vast libraries of knowledge while their actual lived experience remains painfully impoverished. The path of awakening for the investigator requires the terrifying act of leaving the mental fortress. True transformation begins when the five recognizes that their relentless pursuit of knowledge is not actually preparing them for life, but is, in fact, a strategy for perpetually avoiding it. They must observe their automatic habit of shrinking away from contact and hoarding their energy. As they bravely step out of their minds and re-inhabit their physical bodies, they begin to access the profound, visceral power of their integration point, the challenger. They move from detached observation to bold, decisive action. The five discovers that their energy is not a finite, fragile resource to be hoarded, but a boundless, renewable wellspring that regenerates precisely through active engagement with the world. They bring their brilliant insights out of the shadows, offering their visionary gifts as an active, powerful presence in the very reality they once feared. Moving along the perimeter of the thinking center, we encounter the profoundly complex landscape of Type 6, known as the loyalist. While the investigator attempts to manage fear by withdrawing into solitary mental mastery, the loyalist attempts to conquer fear by remaining hypervigilant, constantly scanning the horizon for potential threats, and desperately seeking a reliable structure or authority to trust. Sixes are the glue that holds human society together. They are deeply committed, fiercely loyal, highly responsible, and possess an extraordinary ability to foresee problems before they arise. They are the faithful friends, the dedicated workers, and the courageous advocates for the underdog. Yet, beneath their steadfast exterior, the internal world of the six is a swirling, exhausting tempest of chronic anxiety and ceaseless doubt. The fundamental fear haunting the loyalist is the terrifying conviction of being without support, guidance, or a safe harbor in a hostile universe. To defend against this pervasive dread, their ego develops an intense basic desire to find absolute security, reassurance, and a solid foundation upon which they can rely. In childhood, sixes typically experienced a profound rupture of trust with the authority figures in their lives. The people who were supposed to provide protection were perceived as unpredictable, absent, or dangerously flawed. This shattered the child's innate faith in the stability of the world and in their own internal guidance. They were left floating in a terrifying void, concluding that they must constantly anticipate disaster and align themselves with external structures, be it a belief system, a powerful mentor, a supportive community, or a rigid set of rules to ensure their survival. Because they are grounded in the thinking center, the passion driving the loyalist is fear itself, manifesting as a relentless buzzing anxiety. Their minds resemble an inner committee of conflicting voices, constantly generating worst-case scenarios and second-guessing every decision. This anxiety creates a profound psychological split within the six, leading to two distinct behavioral patterns. The phobic six openly aligns with authority, seeking safety through obedience, warmth, and forming alliances. In contrast, the counterphobic six aggressively confronts their fear, pushing against authority and adopting a tough, rebellious stance to prove that they are not afraid. Yet, whether they are running toward a protector or fighting against a perceived oppressor, the underlying driver remains the exact same terror. They become trapped in a paradoxical loop. They desperately seek absolute certainty from external sources. But because their foundational wound is a lack of trust, they inevitably doubt, test, and eventually tear down the very authorities they have relied upon. To awaken, the loyalist must face the devastating realization that absolute external security is an illusion. The world will always be unpredictable, and no person, dogma, or institution can permanently shield them from the inherent vulnerability of existence. Transformation occurs when the six begins to observe the frantic spinning of their anxious mind without getting caught in the whirlwind of what-ifs. As they stop frantically searching outside themselves for a savior, they naturally move toward the serene, grounded energy of their integration point, the peacemaker. The loud, chaotic committee in their head finally quiets down, and they begin to hear the calm, steady voice of their own inner knowing. They realize that true courage is not the absence of fear, nor is it reckless bravado. It is the quiet, unshakable trust in their own essence, discovering that they themselves possess all the wisdom and support they have been so desperately seeking. Chapter 7. The Enthusiast and the Challenger. To complete our journey through the thinking center, we encounter the most outwardly energetic and relentlessly positive of the mental types. Type 7, known as the enthusiast. While the investigator retreats from fear into solitary contemplation and the loyalist nervously scans the horizon for danger, the enthusiast attempts a radically different strategy. They attempt to outrun fear entirely. Sevens are the spontaneous, joyful adventurers of the human family. They possess a brilliantly quick, synthesizing mind, an infectious optimism, and an extraordinary ability to see the world as a limitless playground of possibilities. They are the visionaries who spark new projects, the life of every party, and the friends who refuse to let the darkness win. Yet this dazzling kaleidoscopic exterior functions as a highly sophisticated defense mechanism, designed to keep a profound, underlying anxiety permanently at bay. The core fear that relentlessly pursues the enthusiast is the terrifying prospect of being deprived, trapped in emotional pain, or suffocated by boredom. To ensure this never happens, their ego constructs a vibrant, basic desire to be happy, fully satisfied, and to have their every need fulfilled. In their early childhood, sevens typically experienced a traumatic disruption in their connection to the nurturing figure in their lives. Feeling cut off from the soothing care they desperately needed, they made an unconscious, survival-based decision to nurture themselves. They learned to distract their minds from the agonizing feelings of abandonment by focusing on exciting toys, future plans, and endless possibilities. They shifted their center of gravity away from the heavy, painful reality of the present moment and projected it entirely into the bright, promising horizon of tomorrow. Because they reside in the realm of the mind, the driving passion of the enthusiast is gluttony. this is rarely a mere physical overindulgence in food. Rather, it is a desperate, insatiable gluttony of the mind. The 7 devours experiences, ideas, conversations, and new adventures, frantically trying to fill an inner void that can never truly be filled by external stimulation. They suffer from an agonizing psychological condition. The anticipation of an event is almost always more thrilling than the event itself. As soon as they acquire what they desire, the excitement evaporates, the underlying anxiety begins to seep back in, and they must immediately fixate their attention on the next grand possibility. They become trapped in a manic, exhausting carousel, skimming the vibrant surface of life while terrified of stopping long enough to feel the profound grief and emptiness waiting in the depths. They mistake the frantic accumulation of experiences for genuine fulfillment. The awakening for the enthusiast requires the ultimate act of courage. They must stop running. Transformation begins the moment the 7 decides to stay put, to sit quietly in the present moment, and to allow the terrifying feelings of sadness, boredom, or anxiety to wash over them without immediately reaching for a distraction. As they brave this internal storm, they discover a miraculous truth. The pain they have spent a lifetime outrunning does not destroy them. When they observe their compulsive need to escape into future planning, the trance of gluttony shatters. They naturally move toward the profound, focused depth of their integration point, the investigator. The frantic, scattered energy consolidates into a quiet, brilliant concentration. They learn to drink deeply from the cup of the present moment, discovering that true, lasting joy is not found in the manic pursuit of the next thrill, but in the rich, fully absorbed experience of the here and now. Crossing the boundary from the mental realm back into the powerful physical territory of the instinctual center, we encounter a dramatic shift in energy. We leave behind the fear-driven avoidance of the enthusiast and step directly into the roaring, confrontational fire of Type 8, known as the Challenger. 8s are the formidable forces of nature within the Enneagram. They possess an immense, undeniable physical presence, a towering strength of will, and a profound drive to protect the weak and champion the underdog. They are the natural leaders, the fearless trailblazers, and the protective, magnanimous giants who carve out their own destinies with sheer, unapologetic force. Yet, this impenetrable armor of toughness hides a secret, fiercely guarded core of profound vulnerability. The absolute foundational fear of the Challenger is the terrifying prospect of being harmed, controlled, or violated by others. To ensure their survival in what they perceive as a fundamentally hostile world, their ego constructs an ironclad basic desire to protect themselves, to be completely self-reliant, and to remain in absolute control of their own lives and destinies. In childhood, 8s often experienced a severe, premature loss of innocence. They were forced to grow up too quickly, often in an environment that felt dangerous, unpredictable, or where they were subjected to the capricious power of adults. They quickly deduced that the world is divided entirely into the strong and the weak. To survive, they made a painful, unconscious decision to completely amputate their own softness, vulnerability, and need for comfort. They hardened their hearts, pushed their energy outward, and resolved that they would never, ever be placed at the mercy of another human being again. Because the Challenger is anchored in the gut triad, their primary emotional engine is raw anger. For the 8, anger is not a shameful loss of control. It is the very fuel of life. Their driving passion is lust, which must be understood not merely as sexual desire, but as a relentless, aggressive push for intensity and dominance in every aspect of existence. 8s lust for power, for visceral impact, and for the absolute command of their environment. They push against people and boundaries to test where the true power lies, mistaking intensity for genuine connection. They live with their guard permanently raised, anticipating betrayal and striking first to ensure they are never caught off guard. This relentless combat stance isolates them profoundly. They long for someone strong enough to meet their immense energy without being crushed, someone who can finally make it safe for them to put down their heavy armor. The path of awakening for the Challenger demands a surrender that feels, to their ego, indistinguishable from death. They must learn to access the very vulnerability they have spent a lifetime despising. Transformation occurs when the 8 begins to observe their automatic reflex to intimidate, control, and harden their hearts against emotional pain. When they risk opening themselves to the terrifying, soft reality of their own tender feelings, the thick crust of the personality breaks open. As they lay down their weapons, they naturally move toward the open-hearted, nurturing energy of their integration point, the helper. Their immense, intimidating power is alchemized into a profound, gentle heroism. They realize that true strength is not the ability to dominate the world, but the courage to remain open, loving, and vulnerable within it. Chapter 8. The Peacemaker. We arrive now at the very summit of the Enneagram, the crown of the circle. Here, at the precise center of the instinctual triad, sits Type 9, known as the Peacemaker. Because the 9 is positioned at the top of the symbol, it is often said that they contain the energy of all the other 8 types within them. They are the universal receivers of the human family, possessing an unparalleled capacity for empathy, acceptance, and profound, unshakable serenity. They are the spiritual seekers, the steadying presence in a chaotic world, and the gentle mediators who effortlessly see every side of a conflict. To be in the presence of a healthy peacemaker is to feel entirely accepted, held in a space of deep, unconditional grace. Yet this extraordinary ability to merge with the universe and bring harmony to others conceals a quiet, devastating tragedy. In their lifelong effort to maintain connection with the world, the 9 has entirely lost connection with themselves. The foundational anxiety driving the peacemaker is a profound, paralyzing fear of fragmentation, separation, and the loss of connection. To defend against this terrifying prospect of being cut off or destroyed by conflict, their ego constructs a simple but relentless basic desire to maintain inner stability and peace of mind at absolutely any cost. In childhood, 9s frequently absorbed a heartbreaking, unspoken message. Their own needs, their anger, and their very presence were somehow too much or, conversely, did not matter at all. To survive in a family system that may have been chaotic, deeply demanding, or simply neglectful, the young 9 made a tragic psychological bargain. They concluded that the only way to maintain a safe connection with their caregivers was to ask for nothing, to suppress their own vitality, and to fade seamlessly into the background. They learned to erase their own identity to keep the peace. Because the peacemaker sits at the exact center of the gut-driven instinctual center, their primary energetic struggle is with the raw, boundary-setting force of anger. But unlike the challenger who expresses anger outwardly, or the reformer who internalizes it as rigid resentment, the 9 simply goes to sleep to it. The driving passion of the peacemaker is sloth. This is rarely a physical laziness. 9s can be incredibly active and hard-working. Rather, it is a profound spiritual sloth, a deep, unconscious refusal to show up for their own lives. They narcotize themselves against any intense feeling, whether it is deep sorrow, fiery anger, or even ecstatic joy. They numb their internal world with comfortable routines, pleasant distractions, repetitive tasks, or by simply tuning out. They build an impenetrable fortress of pleasantness, terrifyingly unaware that the walls they have built to keep out pain have also kept out their own life force. The peacemaker mistakes emotional deadness for genuine spiritual peace. To avoid the terrifying friction of asserting their own desires, they adopt a strategy of merging. They unconsciously absorb the agendas, preferences, and energies of the people around them, mistaking the desires of their partner, family, or friends for their own. They become highly accommodating, saying yes when they mean no, simply because the thought of causing a disruption feels like a threat to their very survival. Yet, because they are fundamentally instinctual types, their suppressed life force eventually pushes back. This resistance manifests as a stubborn, immovable passivity. A 9 will rarely fight you directly, but they will simply dig their heels in and refuse to move, employing a quiet, maddening passive aggression to protect the tiny, hidden scrap of autonomy they have left. They live in a tragic paradox. They desperately want to be connected, but they withdraw so deeply into themselves that genuine connection becomes impossible. The awakening for the peacemaker is arguably the most difficult of all the types, for it requires them to deliberately disturb their own carefully cultivated peace. Transformation begins when the 9 dares to recognize that their inner tranquility is an illusion, a numbness masking a deep, unlived vitality. They must observe their mechanical habit of checking out, of agreeing simply to avoid friction, and of minimizing their own immense value. They must brave the terrifying fire of their own anger, realizing that anger is not a destructive force that will shatter their world, but the very boundary-setting energy they need to claim their own existence. As the peacemaker steps out of the fog of sloth and begins to inhabit their own physical body, they naturally move toward the vibrant, self-affirming energy of their integration point, the achiever. They stop merging with the background and finally step into the spotlight of their own lives. They discover their own voice, articulate their own desires, and take decisive, energetic action in the world. By reclaiming their own worth, their presence ceases to be a passive void and becomes a powerful, radiant force. They realize that true, lasting peace is not the fragile absence of conflict, but the profound, unshakable equanimity that arises only when one is fully awake, fully engaged, and undeniably alive. Chapter 9. Tools for Transformation. Having mapped the 9 distinct landscapes of the human personality, a profound question inevitably arises. What do we do with this knowledge? The discovery of our Enneagram type is frequently accompanied by a sudden, breathtaking clarity. For the first time, the hidden architecture of our struggles, our relational conflicts, and our recurring anxieties is laid bare. Yet, there is a dangerous, seductive trap waiting for us the moment we identify our core type. The ego, ever resourceful and terrified of its own annihilation, instinctively attempts to co-opt this profound spiritual map. It takes our newly discovered Enneagram number and turns it into a badge of honor, a convenient label, or worse, a permanent excuse for our unconscious behavior. We begin to say that we cannot help withdrawing because we are a 5, or that we must be excused for our explosive temper because we are an 8. When we do this, we have taken the very tool designed to unlock our prison and used it to fortify the iron bars. The Enneagram is not meant to be a new, more sophisticated identity. It is an alarm clock. It is meant to wake us up, not to provide us with a more comfortable bed in which to sleep. To truly utilize this map, we must engage in what ancient spiritual traditions simply called the work. The work is the deliberate, conscious practice of staying awake in a world that constantly invites us to fall back asleep. Our ordinary state of consciousness is a kind of waking trance, heavily magnetized by the specific passion and fixations of our personality type. To break this trance, we must cultivate a powerful, impartial inner observer. This is not the harsh, judging voice of the superego that constantly monitors us for mistakes and tells us we are failing. The true inner observer is a space of pure, compassionate, and silent awareness. It watches the mechanics of our personality spinning into motion without attempting to instantly fix, condemn, or overanalyze them. When we catch ourselves in the act of falling into our predictable patterns, when the 3 notices the urge to embellish an achievement, when the 6 feels the familiar spiral of catastrophic thinking, or when the 2 feels the compulsive pull to rescue someone who has not asked for help, the simple act of seeing the mechanism objectively interrupts its power. This observation, however, cannot remain purely intellectual. It must be grounded in the physical body. The human mind is a brilliant time traveler, constantly leaping forward into the anxieties of the future or backward into the regrets of the past. The physical body, by contrast, is always exactly here, in the present moment. Most of our psychological suffering is fueled by a subtle, chronic disconnection from our own physicality. We abandon our bodies to live entirely in the narrow, frantic bandwidth of our racing thoughts. Therefore, the foundational tool for all true transformation is conscious, grounded breathing. When we deliberately direct our attention to the simple rhythmic rise and fall of our breath, and consciously feel the solid ground beneath our feet, we pull our scattered energy back from the illusions of the ego and into the reality of the present. We literally bring ourselves back to life. In this state of grounded presence, the terrifying, compulsive demands of the personality begin to lose their overwhelming urgency. As we deepen this practice of self-observation and presence, we inevitably encounter the shadow side of growth. We will often feel significantly worse before we feel better. For decades, our personality type has functioned as a highly effective emotional anesthetic, numbing us to our deepest childhood wounds and our underlying core fears. When we begin to dismantle these defenses, the anesthetic wears off. The raw, unhealed pain we have spent a lifetime avoiding suddenly rushes to the surface of our awareness. The peacemaker will feel the terrifying, burning heat of their own suppressed rage. The achiever will face the agonizing, silent void of their hidden worthlessness. The enthusiast will come face to face with their paralyzing grief. In these moments, the temptation to retreat into our old, familiar habits is almost irresistible. The terrified ego screams that this practice is destroying us, urging us to run back to the safety of our old illusions. But we must understand with absolute clarity that this pain is not a sign of failure. It is the definitive proof of healing. It is the painful, necessary thawing of the frozen soul. To endure this thawing process, we must learn the profound art of relaxing into our discomfort rather than tensing against it. When emotional pain or deep anxiety arises, our automatic instinct is to tighten our physical muscles, hold our breath, and mentally reject the experience. This resistance only locks the pain more deeply into our nervous system, giving it the exact energy it needs to persist. True transformation requires the radical courage to stay with the difficult feeling, breathing steadily into it with an open heart. We must sit in the fire of our own psychological discomfort without acting out, without blaming others, and without immediately seeking a convenient distraction. As we do this, a profound internal alchemy occurs. The terrifying emotion, whether it is deep shame, paralyzing fear, or explosive anger, begins to lose its solid, overwhelming density. It reveals itself simply as a temporary wave of energy passing through the vast, unbroken space of our essential nature. We discover the magnificent truth that we are not our passing emotions, we are the limitless sky in which they appear. Ultimately, the goal of this relentless psychological and spiritual work is the complete recovery of our essence. As the rigid defensive structures of the personality soften and become transparent, the divine qualities we have been starving for our entire lives begin to arise spontaneously from within us. We realize that we no longer have to frantically manufacture love, secure our own peace, or prove our inherent value to the world. We recognize that these qualities have always been our intrinsic birthright, merely obscured by the heavy armor we wore to survive. The Enneagram guides us back to the exact emotional coordinates where we first lost our way, providing us with the precise map to navigate the dark, tangled forest of our own childhood conditioning. But the map cannot walk the path for us. We must take the daily, courageous steps of showing up for our own lives, observing our mechanical habits with profound, unyielding compassion, and daring to believe that we are infinitely more than the narrow, frightened identity we have settled for. The tools for transformation are already in our hands. We have only to awaken and use them. Chapter 10. The Spiritual Journey, Always Now. As we reach the culmination of this profound psychological mapping, a dangerous and nearly universal illusion begins to take root in the mind. The ego, having absorbed the intricate mechanics of the Enneagram, eagerly attempts to turn spiritual transformation into yet another project to be completed. We imagine that liberation is a glorious destination lying somewhere in the distant future, a final state of permanent enlightenment where we will never again feel the sting of our core fears or the pull of our conditioned passions. We convince ourselves that if we just read enough, meditate perfectly enough, or observe ourselves strictly enough, we will eventually cross a finish line and graduate from the human condition. Yet, the ultimate and most humbling revelation of this entire journey is that there is no finish line, and there is no future salvation. The spiritual journey does not take place in the future. It occurs entirely and exclusively in the relentless, uncompromising reality of the now. The personality survives almost entirely by rejecting the present moment. Our ego structures were forged in the past as desperate defenses against childhood pain, and they sustain themselves by projecting endless anxieties and idealized fantasies into the future. The 3 survives by anticipating tomorrow's applause. The 6 survives by calculating tomorrow's disasters. The 4 survives by longing for a future rescuer who will redeem the tragedy of the past. To the personality, the present moment is terrifyingly empty because it offers no leverage, no drama, and no escape. When we truly drop into the now, the frantic machinery of the ego stalls. We are forced to encounter reality exactly as it is, without the protective, colorful filters of our Enneagram type. This is why the ego will invent incredibly sophisticated spiritual excuses to avoid being present. It will gladly memorize the entire Enneagram system if doing so allows it to avoid the simple, excruciating vulnerability of taking one fully conscious, grounded breath in the present moment. To truly step onto the spiritual path, we must surrender the exhausting demand that we must change, fix, or perfect ourselves before we can be whole. The Enneagram does not ask us to wage a violent war against our basic type. The reformer does not need to brutally murder their inner critic. The helper does not need to amputate their deep desire to be loved. The challenger does not need to crush their immense vitality. True transformation is not an act of destruction, but an act of profound unconditional embrace. When we bring the light of silent, compassionate awareness to our darkest, most compulsive habits, those habits spontaneously begin to dissolve, returning their trapped energy to our essence. We begin to understand that our deepest wounds and our greatest flaws were never the enemy. They were the very doorways through which our soul was inviting us to awaken. As this awakening deepens, the rigid boundaries between the 9 types begin to soften and dissolve. We realize that while we have a home base, we are not ultimately confined to a single point on the circle. In our highest states of integration, we have access to the entire spectrum of human divinity. We can summon the fierce, protective courage of the 8 without needing to dominate. We can access the radiant, unconditional love of the 2 without needing to manipulate. We can embody the profound, quiet peace of the 9 without falling asleep to our own lives. We become fluid, moving gracefully around the Enneagram as the present moment demands, no longer reacting from mechanical compulsion, but responding from a place of deep, spontaneous wisdom. We discover that we are the entire circle, the unbroken wholeness of life expressing itself through the beautiful, temporary vessel of our humanity. The journey we have taken through the Enneagram ultimately leads us back to the exact place where we started, but with eyes that are finally capable of seeing. It leads us back to the ordinary, mundane reality of our daily lives, washing the dishes, sitting in traffic, listening to a friend, or feeling the simple ache of a tired body. But it is here, in the unglamorous simplicity of the now, that the miraculous occurs. When we strip away the relentless demands of the personality, we realize that the universe is not a hostile environment we must conquer, hide from, or placate. We realize that the love, the peace, and the profound value we have been frantically chasing our entire lives have always been quietly resting at the very center of our own being. There is nothing left to search for, and nowhere else to go. The lock was an illusion, and you have always possessed the key. The prison doors are wide open. All that remains is to step out of the shadows of your history, take a breath, and take your rightful place in the radiant, indestructible light of the present moment. The journey is not over. It is simply and forever just beginning.